Hi, my name is Sandy Middleton. I am a parent, an educator. I'm originally from South Carolina. I have lived in Cambridge for almost 40 years. I've parented in Cambridge, I've worked in Cambridge, I've volunteered in Cambridge. Since 2019, I have been working as an ESL instructor at the Cambridge Center for Adult Ed. Previous jobs in Cambridge were as the Director of Education Services, as well as development work for Transition House. My very first job in Cambridge back in the early 70s was as the receptionist at the Riverside Health Center over on Callender Street. And I also spent some time, very happy time, acting as a volunteer person sitting in the visitor center in the kiosk in Harvard Square. Currently, I am in a precarious housing situation. I am about to become homeless. When I moved back here to Cambridge, I rented an apartment with my 2 adult sons because that was the only way that we could afford to live here in Cambridge. When we found out that the lease was going to end and the rent would be going up, I contacted the Cambridge Housing Authority, where I and my adult son with a disability were both on the wait list, hoping and praying to clear it. However, I've heard that sometimes that can take 10 or more years, which seems really unreasonable to me. However, housing in Cambridge for me as a single parent with 2 boys has always been a challenge. I had to move from Cambridge to Somerville and change my kids' school back when they were young because we couldn't afford an apartment in Cambridge. And back in the early mid 80s, Somerville offered some more affordable options. At any rate, here we are now. I turned to Cambridge Housing Authority for support, guidance, and advice about what I could do, where I could go for myself and my son with a disability. They recommended to me that I apply for housing at Congregate Housing. For my son, we applied for all sorts of housing situations, lotteries, so many, it's unbelievable, but nothing has come to fruition. As a result, with our move date imminent, and Cambridge Housing not being able to offer us, either of us, anything concrete, I began to get desperate and really quite worried. So my son's father secured an apartment for him near his building where he lives. And my son will be paying $750 of his Social Security benefit, and his father will be funding the remaining $750. I have no resources. I am going to be homeless. And that was causing me a lot of stress, high blood pressure, and a lot of sleepless nights. And that was my predicament until a friend, a kind friend, offered to share her space with me until I could have more stability in my housing situation. I don't want to be dislocated from Cambridge. I like Cambridge. It's not perfect, but I value the cultural diversity and the educational opportunities, the socialization that only Cambridge can uniquely offer. And I want to stay here. And what I hope that Cambridge Housing will be able to do for me and other people like me is not displace us, but to find places, affordable places that we can live, that I can pay for with my Social Security benefits and my earned income. I still work. I am 70 years old now, but I want to stay here in Cambridge. I want Cambridge to be a place that sustains people who want to be here and who have lived here for many years. That's what I would really like for Cambridge to become, a place that sustains elders like myself. Thank you.
My name is Kathy. I've lived in Cambridge about 36 years, and when I came here, we still had rent control, and Cambridge was a completely different place. I fell in love with it. People, all kinds of different people. It's really quite different and not nearly as rich now. I've had to move around quite often in Cambridge. After rent control, I found an apartment that was affordable, but it started, the rent started to creep up. I was able, after being on a wait list for about 4 years, I received a voucher, and I was fortunate that my landlady would accept it. However, then she ended up selling the house where I lived, and I've lived in various different places due to having to move around due to gentrification or places that were untenable to live. And now I'm living in an industrial area on the outskirts of Cambridge in an inclusionary unit in one of these market rate buildings, which I thought was going to be amazing because, a luxury, but they're not luxury. They're built or at least this building is built incredibly shoddily. And there's a national management company that runs it who really only cares about the bottom line and trying to sell things to us, and trying to rent to people, but is not concerned at all about the people who are actually living here, in the moment. So I would like to leave, but I'm stuck here. That's one problem with most affordable housing that I've come across, is that you are not allowed to transfer, even if there's some kind of reasonable accommodation. It's still very hard. As a matter of fact, the Attorney General years ago sued the Cambridge Housing Authority because they would not let people move, even for reasons of disability. So you can imagine it's still very, very difficult. And one of the things that I would really like is to live in an actual neighborhood, not in this sort of area of the city that there's nothing here. It's not close to the T. There's just no infrastructure in this part of Cambridge. And I feel like I'm not even part of Cambridge anymore. I also, I've done various tenant organizing, but it's been quite difficult because we haven't had any money. Finally, I would like tenants to have control of where they live, and also a say in the building of these affordable properties around the city.
Hi, my name is Stephanie Garan. I grew up in Newtown Court in Cambridge, and I now live with a friend who owns her house. Growing up in Newtown Court, when we finally got there after a stint of childhood homelessness on my part, it felt like a refuge. There was some security in knowing that the rent would go up incrementally, and that it was also based on your income. And so my mom, I'm from a single parent, female headed household, African descended immigrants, low income. We check all the boxes. But my mom took her rent very seriously, and we we never got in trouble with Cambridge Housing Authority. She took pride in her home. And it wasn't until, I'd say maybe 2009 when I finished up with undergrad, and I hadn't secured a house or a job yet because it was the middle of the Great Recession. And I went to move back home with my mom, and it turns out that if I moved back there without being enrolled in school, or if I didn't have a job, that her rent would go up. And so I decided that I didn't want my mom's rent to go up, so I moved out. Officially, I changed my residence to elsewhere. And this problem kept on coming up as like my younger siblings aged up. And by the time it was 20 years, my mom had been living in the projects, like paying rent every month for 20 years to Cambridge Housing Authority. They had hired a third-party recertification agency. They started harassing my mom, and if anyone knows my mom, she's like diligent about like paperwork. And so she, before recertification every other year, she gets all her paperwork together, puts it in a stack ahead of schedule. She takes it over to Cambridge Housing Authority because she doesn't like to get in trouble. And so by this point, they had hired this third-party agency who started harassing her, claiming that she was hiding money. Now, anyone who also knows my mom knows that she has no money. I remember finding out how poor we were in 2005 when I was going to university. Filling out the FAFSA, I found out in 2005 my mom made $27,500 a year. By 2019, my mom made $32,355 a year. And so she had no money, but my mom had been making regular payments into her 401k. And at this point, she was like 62. And so she's like preparing for retirement. And the third-party agency claimed that her 401k counted as income, and so they needed to raise her rent. And at this point, she was already paying $1,600 a month, which was well above her 30% of her net income. And she feared that she was going to have to start paying like 60% of her net income. And she was concerned, so she decided to leave Cambridge Housing Authority before she could even qualify for senior homes. And so she left, and my mom no longer lives in Cambridge, even though that's where she spent most of my life, which is quite a long time for her too. So she lost a lot of community and connection. She moved to Malden, where she doesn't have a sense of community. She just like sleeps there and goes to work every day. I was fortunate enough to move in with a friend who owns her house in Cambridge. And that's how I'm able to stay a Cambridge resident. But I live in a space, like I don't have my own apartment or anything. And so it's not as if my mom can move in with me. So yeah, that's my story.
Hey, I'm glad I could be a part of this. My name is Steve Brown. I've lived and worked in Cambridge. I currently work for the First Church Shelter as an overnight manager, and I manage at a film archive at Harvard, which is now actually dark because of the pandemic. And I've been, part of the community, volunteering and living, like I said, for the last over 25 years. I first moved to Cambridge in the early 90s and had the good fortune of scoring a share in a rent control place on Ellery Street. And I think at the time we paid $350, $375 a piece. And 3 months after I moved in, the rent control was voted out on a statewide referendum. And I'm sure that apartment now goes for a lot more than 700. So right now, in 2021, May, June, I find myself basically squatting at a friend's house in Medford because I was in a rather long-term situation in a beautiful but dingy basement on Raymond Street, and my friend who was my landlord, who was my tenant, who I helped out and paid a nominal rent in exchange, he passed away. And basically the kids, quite understandably, wanted to get this asset on the market as soon as possible. So I had 45 days to relocate or to get out. So, and this was, it was the middle of COVID. And actually I found myself kind of lucky that I found this. But it's month to month. I think my friend has other plans. She would like to rent it at a market rate come September, so I've got to look for something else. I'd really like to be back in Cambridge. I feel like this is where I've made my kind of life. I contribute here, but I'm just completely priced out of the market. I work in at a homeless shelter. I don't make a lot of money. I'm sure someone who's starting in tech in Cambridge makes 5, 6, 7 times more than I do, and I'm just not. It's not possible for me to pay what I would have to pay, probably 80% of my monthly income just to pay for a studio. So I taken the steps to get onto the inclusionary housing list through Cambridge Housing, through the city, and it's a program where you are, if you're within certain income guidelines, you can pay 30% of what your monthly income is. So that will be doable, but I'm sure, like I said, I'm in the process of getting that paperwork in, but I'm sure there's a wait list that's years, and that there are probably people that are even higher priority than I am. So it's just a waiting game. I think it's kind of ironic that I'm kind of caring and helping the homeless, and I'm homeless myself, pretty much. And although I know it could be a lot worse, and I've got options that other people certainly don't have. So, in a nutshell, that's my story. I wish I could be back in Cambridge in a situation that's sustainable, and hopefully the city will be able to maybe expand its inclusionary housing program or help kind of stabilize the rental market here, so someone like me who works in human services and contributes to the cultural life of Cambridge, that they can call Cambridge their home too. Thanks.
Thank you for those testimonies, for sharing your vulnerable stories. We understand that in a time like this, to share such a story, especially around housing, it's a very hard thing to do. And it definitely makes you feel like, where is your human rights, right? When there should be a human right to housing, and what does that look like when individuals are sharing their stories and saying that they don't have access to housing in the way that they should. So I am going to introduce our.
Aisha, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes.
Oh, sorry. I guess I came on.
Welcome, Richard.
Yeah.
So if you wanna, go ahead.
So thank you all again. As you heard our testimonies, I think Aisha spoke to the human reality that is the housing crisis in Cambridge and in the Metro Boston area. I just wanted to welcome everybody again and Remember that this is being recorded. And I just want to start us off with a quick introduction to what we're going to be talking about tonight. A recent study found that affordable housing is the top concern of Cambridge residents. 21,000 people are currently on the public housing voucher list and also the public housing waiting list. And among the renters and owners, Black households in Cambridge are the most cost burden. In the last 10 years, the proportion of Black residents fell by almost half, going from 15 to 8%. Tonight, we want to focus on the specific problems and solutions to meet the needs of moderate income and low income residents and how we can create affordable housing, but also how can we meet their needs to control their destiny around housing, particularly around buying housing and also renting affordable housing. And how can we create secure housing where people can care for their families and be connected to their communities? And we want to make sure that we're having this conversation in the most broad sense, but at times we're going to bring this down to the situation, we're going to bring it down to real finite families, as you just heard individuals speaking about their own plight as it relates to housing. I'm going to give a brief introduction just because I think we're blessed to have this esteemed group of panelists and experts. First is I'm going to bring the Honorable Lydia Edwards, Boston City Council, I believe representing East Boston. Welcome, Councilor. Thank you. You're always welcome across the bridge, even if it's virtually. The councilor has spent her entire career as an advocate, activist, and a voice on behalf of society's most vulnerable. She served as a deputy director within the Mayor's Office of Housing and Stability, where she was responsible for developing and delivering innovative solutions to fight the displacement of people in the housing area, bringing all stakeholders together. So welcome, Councilor. Thank you for having us. Alex Capellan, I don't want to mess it up, but he's a housing activist and organizer. He works or organizes with City Life Vita Urbana. He grew up in Boston and came to know Cambridge as a teenager. I did that too. I knew Cambridge well as a teenager, but he's an activist whose experiences with the police led him to organize for change. He was a political director of the Young Democrats at the University of Washington College of Law and received his LLM in taxation from the Boston University School of Law. Excuse me, that was Lydia, right? Correct, yeah, sorry. He was a political director for Young Democrats of the Massachusetts Latino Caucus and founder of the Boston Young Abolitionists. Dr. Brian Sargent, who I'm just gonna say he's gonna be leaving us a little early today. We know he has to get on the road, but thank you for being with us. He is the assistant professor of public policy at the Department of Sociology at UMass Boston, am I correct?
Amherst.
UMass Amherst. My daughter just graduated from there. Great school. And he also has a PhD from Northwestern University and his master's degree from Northwestern in the University of Chicago, and was a pre-doctoral research associate in sociology at the University of Washington. So thank you, thank you, thank you. We're going to jump right in. Some questions will be for individuals and others would be for a couple of you, but we just want you to take a couple of minutes to think about these questions and help the audience to work through these, hopefully leading to some solution. Cambridge has changed significantly from being a city with racial and economic diversity to one with the Black and brown and low and moderate income residents being pushed out. What would need to happen to make Cambridge racially and economically diverse again? We'll start with Councilor Edwards, if she could jump in.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I'm happy to come across the bridge, especially even if it is through Zoom. Just launching right into it, it's going to take the same thing that any other city or town is going to take, and that's holding up a mirror and being honest about how we got here. Because you can't come up with policies and say we need to solve these issues and problems without really acknowledging what we did to cause them. And I think there is a cause and effect, and there's a true analysis. We didn't get here by accident. There wasn't just a poof and Black people slowly began to have to leave Cambridge. There was concerted efforts. There were laws passed. There were measures removed. There were assistance and grants that were reduced. And either people didn't care or they could see the results and said it didn't matter. But these were intentional acts that resulted in this. And so it's going to take acknowledging that, undoing some of them, and then saying when we plan and when we think, we will have to center then Black and brown people and they're coming back to and thriving in Cambridge. You must center your policy then with that as the goal and be unapologetic about it. But there's no dancing around it. We got here through our hands must undo it, and we have to call, say it, name it, and then center it.
Right, I appreciate that. Brian, you want to take a stab at this?
Yes, thank you. Yes, so I think one of the first steps would be to understand, this is related to what Councilor Edwards just spoke to, but it relates to the fact that we have to be in a position where we acknowledge that there are no win-wins when the market is as central to housing as the people are. If we call residents stakeholders, if we call landlord stakeholders, and if we call development companies stakeholders or management stakeholders, then we misrepresent those as being equal when they're not. The problem is that we understand how to house people. We understand how to build community. It only gets complicated when we decide that we have to do that at a profit for some. In that the question then becomes, how many people are we willing to leave behind? As long as that is the approach, then it becomes exceedingly complicated. It becomes exceedingly difficult to manage. And along the way, the market has ways of making unreasonable things seem reasonable. It is not reasonable to leave people behind. It's not reasonable to leave people displaced. It's not reasonable to leave people unhoused. Rather than seeing housing as a market phenomenon, you have to see it as a community good and invest in it as a community good, because it does more than, housing instability does more than just leave some people without shelter. It affects so many other areas, from health to the environment, to education, to civic participation and citizenship, et cetera. The list goes on and on and on. So if we're going to understand that community only happens when these things are present, then we also have to understand that we have to center, as Edward said, like the people themselves. And that means letting go of some ideas of what a win-win looks like and changing our ideas of success.
No, I think that's an absolute great point. I think that, and I like the way you said that, the community has to be the main stakeholder. Alex, you want to give this a shot? This particular question? Alex? All right, looks like Alex is frozen. Alex, one more shot. All right, this next question I'm going to skip over because it was actually for Alex. It looks like he's having some technical difficulties. But maybe we'll just try it, starting with Councilor Edwards again. What tenant protections like rent control and other tenants' rights can keep rents affordable, and what would it take to get them as policy, whether it be rent control or other things that you've seen in your experience? What would be helpful? Why don't we start with Councilor Edwards, and then Alex will jump back in just to get him. I don't think he heard the question, Councilor. You're on mute, Councilor.
All the technical things. Oh my goodness. My apologies. So I'll be brief because Alex is the community organizer, grassroots person, and but there are policies that certainly that generate revenue that we need. Let's be honest, like a transfer fee, and basically disincentivizing flipping homes to the immediate profit of somebody by putting in a tax, but also putting in a transfer fee of 2%, which we tried to do. Many cities have tried to do this, so that if they're selling at luxury rates, we would have, in at least Boston, at 2% transfer fee would have raised $100 million a year. And that would have gone to the Housing Trust to help pay for our new city voucher program, which we now have, which is another example. The city literally creating its own voucher program, not just using Section 8, but literally supplementing it. So we actually fill in the gaps to keep people in public housing. But I'm hoping when we double it, that we'll be able to use it for people who are just above too rich for traditional Section 8, but really cannot afford this market at all. So I was hoping that the cities and municipalities come up with their own Section 8 programs. Then there's just outright just cause eviction, which I know Alex will speak to, basically reducing why you can tell someone to leave the home if they're paying rent and so on and so forth. So I want to be brief because I have been, because Alex, this was, his moment and his kind of question, but I can come up with other policies as well when you come back around.
Okay, thank you. Alex, you're back. Thank you. We asked the counselor a question. She kind of stepped in for you right there. But the question is, what tenant protections like rent control and other tenant rights can keep rent affordable, and what will it take to keep them? Or get them?
Right. So I'm gonna answer both this one and the previous question, and I'm sorry for the technical problems. I had to hop off, get on my phone.
There you go.
But yes, what would need to happen so that we can make sure that working class people, Black people, Indigenous people, people of color can stay in Cambridge? And the most important thing that needs to happen is mass organizing. And that is the people organizing to putting a stop to what's happening. It's really that simple. Like what's really happening is people making decisions, and as a result, we're being pushed out. And these people can make other decisions. Literally in every single case that we just heard of those folks sharing their stories, those outcomes could have been different if we were organized. Every one of those cases has been a story that has come to City Life, our organization. Very similar stories. My landlord just bought the building. He's telling me to leave. Residents, a lot of tenants don't know that they don't have to leave. It is their right to fight out an eviction in court, and only a judge can officially tell you to leave. And by organizing and by fighting it out, you can come to an agreement with the landlord that can, even in the case where the man that was Steve, I think his name was, he was living in an apartment where the person passed away and the children wanted to sell the house to make money, which is fine, but they're making a ton of money on selling that house. An agreement could have been struck between this person and the new landlords that, okay, maybe a certain piece of that money that you're about to get goes to helping me get into a new apartment. And these agreements happen all the time at City Life, but it takes people realizing that they can negotiate and they can fight, and there are tools that we can help you with in getting agreements that can help folks out. And all it really takes is organizing on a case-by-case basis like this. It can be on a building-by-building basis by building a tenant association in the entire building. It can be around development. Say you don't like a development coming into the area, then go to those public meetings and talk about what do you want to see in your area. But there has to be massive organizing happening. And the second question about protections, the most important protection we can do right now is pass the COVID housing equity bill, because so many people right now are in danger of being evicted. Our state moratorium on eviction was expired last October when our governor decided not to extend it. And since then, 17,000 evictions have been filed in Massachusetts. And the only thing that's been protecting us from those evictions moving forward is the federal moratorium on evictions, which expires at the end of this month. At the end of this month, those protections will be gone. There's a survey out there that 45,000 households in Massachusetts are at risk of being evicted because they're behind on rent. So what's going to happen at the end of the month when this eviction moratorium is lifted? We are afraid for our people. We're still dealing with the pandemic and the recovery. So the most important thing we need to do right now, and I like the other legislation ideas proposed by Lydia Edwards, but right now we need to focus on the recovery of our people, because a lot of folks are still hurting right now.
Right.
And we
Alex,
can't just pretend like nothing's wrong.
Alex, why don't you put that in the chat so that people can remember that? The COVID housing equity bill I'm sure it has a Senate or House number, but I think that's good, important information for our audience.
Right. You
gonna
can
go
find
in-
more information at Homes for All
Yeah,
Mass.
Alex, why don't you put it in the chat? That'll work better. If you could help us and just throw it in the chat. Thank you. The next question, and we're gonna have Brian start this. Public housing provides stability, affordability, and community, but wait lists for it are many years long and residents are burdened by oversight restrictions and increasing rents. How can we get more of it and eliminate the problems?
So that's a complicated situation. On the one hand, it's straightforward, but it's almost, you just, in terms of what you do, you build more of it. The hard part comes in when it comes to where does the money come from? That is, I think, tied to something Alex said, which is part of that is about organizing. This is a political problem at a certain degree. There is money, it's just not being spent here. Now there's not enough money to find a space in Cambridge for 22,000 people solely within Cambridge. Some of that money will probably have to come from other levels of government. That's just one of those things that happens, but there's organizing that can occur because the things that are affecting people in Cambridge are not just happening in Cambridge. Some of those, like part of that process of realizing some of the problems is also connecting it to larger phenomenon in building coalitions across municipalities, for instance, and across states, et cetera. But funding is one of the primary areas. I think the second one is having a conversation about housing and having a conversation about policing and not having them really meet is a problem when federal funds connect those two deeply in terms of eligibility. So if you have over-policing that results in felonies, that means entire families can oftentimes be excluded from public housing if there's any federal funds involved at all. And a lot of times it's hard to get public housing done in any form without any amount of federal funds taking some role. The end result is federal restrictions with city policing produce a toxic mix that can put children on the street, put families in the street, or make it hard to get back in. And so in terms of restrictions, there's also needs to be an understanding that as we come to a better awakening, well, not really awakening, most folks know, but a better organizing power around police abolition and decarceral politics, there needs to be an understanding that has that one of the benefits of that is around housing stability. It's around community, it's around building a space for people, and it's around keeping families together, not just in terms of who is shipped off, but also in terms of having a home. So I think that is something that even if you don't have a lot of funds, there's better ways of handling it, because a lot of times what ends up happening is the lists get long because you have people that are being split up, and so people have to try to figure out what list they can be on, and they're all over the place, and then you end up like multiple counts because people are just trying to get somewhere. If consolidating families is one way of making that a little bit easier, it doesn't reduce the need to actually organize around increasing funding for housing. We have the money in this country. We have the space in this country. We know how to build density in this country. We just don't do it. But we can.
Yeah, good stuff. And I would just say that Cambridge is an anomaly. Cambridge has the money. We have a lot of problems here in Cambridge. Money's not one of them. Alex, in 90 seconds, can you also jump in on this particular question, following up on Dr. Sargent's response?
I am going to sound like a broken record tonight and just keep talking about organizing because it's just really like the only tool that I know of, and in my work that's really seen the right type of change. And in Boston right now with the public housing, what we're seeing is the housing authority teaming up with private developers and private companies to redevelop and to revitalize. And a lot of folks are afraid that, once that happens, there's going to be displacement there. Not everyone who lived there originally is going to come back. And that's true for the most part. I used to live in public housing in Lenox Street. And in that redevelopment, my parents decided to move because they didn't want to deal with the hassle. And a lot of people go through that So it just really takes the community, all eyes on the project, showing up to all the public hearings, and sharing their testimony about what they want. Like in the Mildred C. Haley Apartments, also being redeveloped in Jamaica Plain. BHA teamed up with Jamaica Plain Neighborhood, JPNDC. They teamed up with Urban Edge and the community builders. And in their vision for the redevelopment, the community builders wanted to build units that were at over 170% AMI, which is ridiculous. It's like you have to be making, one person has to be making around 140K to live there. And the community came out to those meetings, they said no to it, and they revised their plan to get rid of those units. So those are the type of small wins that can be made around public housing when you have a real organized force behind it.
No, that's a great point. I think that, we've seen some situations in Cambridge where the community kind of came out, but at the end, the political will of the people sitting did not necessarily represent what Cambridge residents thought was the way we ought to go, but we should do more organizing to fix that. This next question is for Councilor Edwards. For decades, zoning has been used to exclude Black and Brown and all low-income people from some neighborhoods. Could zoning be a tool to provide more housing in areas for low and moderate income people? Councilor, how did you approach this in Boston? I know that you did some extraordinary work there. I don't know that everybody on the Cambridge side knows about it, but if you could help us by answering the question, but also being specific about what you did in Boston, I think it'll be helpful to the conversation.
Sure. So context is, as you mentioned in this question says, zoning has by far been the most effective tool to segregate people. It has been wonderfully effective at undoing any civil rights legislation when it came down to the actual communities where the civil rights legislation was supposed to be enacted or enforced. And so traditionally, we have always treated housing discrimination and racial integration as more of a, we'll sue you to stop you from doing bad things. That's it. But only if you can prove to a certain standard that you actually did the bad things happen to you, and only if they happen because of racial problems. That's it. And that's been our policy for almost 50 years. Obama came up with he didn't come up with, he decided to write regulations and bring about the affirmatively furthering fair housing standard, which means more than just saying don't do bad things. It's remove obstacles to opportunity. And you must take meaningful actions to remove obstacles to opportunity. That's huge. That's what housing policy is supposed to do. Trump decided he wanted to get away with it. So Boston said, we're going to step up and do our own. And that's where my zoning act amendment comes in. Basically taking that standard to remove obstacles to opportunity and putting it in zoning. And so when you come forward to in the city of Boston with a project of a certain size, now you must show how that project affirmatively furthers fair housing in order for you to get zoning relief, in order for you to continue. That means you have to demonstrate a couple things. We'll give you a report at the very beginning when you file, demonstrating the historic exclusion of that area. We're going to acknowledge, hold the mirror up, what's happened, why does this area look the way it does? And we'll also give you a displacement analysis report, because the place could be on fire too. In any event, Miss or Mr. Developer, you are not going to be able to say you didn't know, and you're not going to be able to say that your purchase in this community doesn't mean that you are now part of helping, you must be part of helping it to heal. So that's what the zoning requires. We give a list of mitigation and we measure that. And we say, you aren't helping, you're hurting, and you don't get to go forward. And so that policy, I'm sorry, I know it's complicated. I'm going to bring it home right now, but that policy and the injuries that come about, every single community has them. And I will say this, Cambridge, what you have that we don't have is absolutely much more control over your zoning. Your city council can do your zoning. What it took for us to do this, the hoops, the hurdles, the headache, you guys could do this and come up with your own standard to affirmatively further fair housing, of which you hold developers to. And you have the federal law to back you up to say you're supposed to do it anyway. You could come up with the policies that center Black and Brown people through your zoning in a much more aggressive way.
Yeah. So no, I didn't want to stop you. I think that what your last 30 seconds is exactly what I was going to say. This is a lesson to be learned by our city council. It's always, you know, the bureaucracy is deep and it's the planning board and it's this and it's that, but ultimately the sole responsibility in the social justice of zoning relies on the city council that believes in this is the just and right thing. For Dr. Sargent, this question's for you. There's a huge difference in the wealth of white and blacks in adults, in Greater Boston. The most important reason for this is that Black people were prevented from buying homes and accumulating equity. There are limited equity home ownership programs. We have those in Cambridge, but are there or should there be ways for low and moderate income home buyers to build up their equity in their homes, whether or not they're in these programs? So the limited equity programs that we have, you know, you buy a home through a program, there's no real wealth made. If you transfer it, it goes back into a bank and someone else steps up. But what can you tell us about other programs or this wealth discrepancy due to the lack of home ownership?
So I think there's two ways of balancing this out. There's the short term and there's the long term. In the short term, limited equity programs are good in terms of extending housing, but the challenge is over the long haul, it becomes exceedingly difficult for to address in any way, shape, or form the racial wealth gap in any way. Like when housing and home ownership remains one of the key drivers of wealth accumulation in this country. Part of the majority of my research centers around the ways in which white supremacy has adapted to different policy regimes in the face of various anti-racist progressive policies designed to stop segregation and extraction through city policies like and housing policies. So across regimes, it keeps adapting. At one point, it's restrictive covenants. At another point, it's redlining. At another point, it becomes contract housing. At another point, it's predatory inclusion in subprime mortgages. It changes, it changes, it changes, it changes. The thing that's the same is that Black, Indigenous, and people of color remain not only on the outside of that system, but stolen from. It is like, and so the idea that there's a set of policies that can be developed where homeownership is suddenly the problem of homeownership is solved such that we can do things that we couldn't do before is, I think, a losing battle. Housing and housing people and housing stability can be solved. Racial capitalism through housing is not a solution, is not the process. That's not it. That's the simplest way of putting it. That's not it. That's not a game. That's not a winning game. There's ways of addressing wealth inequality, but not through home ownership, not on a one-on-one basis. It doesn't mean that you remove it. Now that's why I say, and that's the long run, right? The short run, yes, you can help build equity. Some of the things you can do to stop equity from being destroyed are dealing with real estate realtor steering programs and other mechanisms that, and a lot of other things that turn communities of color in general into places that have in general lower property values. So that would be how homes are evaluated, how they're assessed, how infrastructure is built around homes, environmental justice that tends to put people of color in places where the externalities of capitalism produce more pollution and fewer resources. These are things that put even when you have low and moderate income homeowners, when you have Black and brown people that have homes, they tend to be in places that where there's other things that make building equity more difficult. So you can build it to a certain degree, but at the end of the day, I think the bigger problem is that's not a process by which we actually solve the fundamental wealth inequality gaps. It doesn't mean we can't do things to stop people that own houses from building. but it's not a long-term solution. It never has been. That version of the American dream has always been a lie.
Always been a lie. Powerful. To Councilor Edwards, how would an Office of Housing Stability in Cambridge help residents?
Well, I can't speak to in Cambridge specifically. In Boston, I can tell you what we tried to do. That's out of respect for my colleagues. I think it's Councilor Carlone and Zondervan, who I saw might be here. So this is out of respect and love, one councilor to another. I'm not trying to encroach, I promise.
I think they're probably watching you, so that's good political etiquette. But we need you. But we need you here. The people need you. Let's go.
Okay. So, okay, I'll just tell you what the Office of Housing Stability is. It's a moral statement from the municipal government saying there is someone at the state whose only focus and job of this department is dealing with displacement. It isn't, you center that. Displacement is the crisis, so we're going to dedicate the money, the time, expertise to coming up with all sorts of things. Half those policies, the transfer fee, acquisition opportunity program, which is where the city is just buying units and getting them off the private market. A lot of these innovative things come from that office. This is where you direct money. This is how you raise money. This is how you, these are incentives for some landlords to keep people in there. We had a landlord kind of an insurance program. Get someone on Section 8 for 2 years and we'll work with you and we'll make sure that you get all these incentives, but making sure that they don't evict people. We had housing clinics. And so you come up with that's what I did, 24 hours, thinking ways to keep people in their homes. And then you end up with a staff that deal with people in immediate crisis. And then you come up with long-term policies and work with organizers. I met with City Life and several organizations on a monthly basis. Because we were like, it can't just come from inside this little office. It had to come to the office from City Life, but we also had to amplify and move those policies immediately in city dollars.
Nice. Alex, you're not elected yet, so you don't have to worry about my good friend, Councilor Carlone. Thank you for being here, as well as Councilor Zondervan. And I also want to acknowledge school committee member Aisha Wilson. Please let me know if there's any other electeds here I can't see, but give it to us. Councilor Edwards said that she worked with you. What do you think about a housing stability office that might help Cambridge residents? Talk to us.
I really love what Councilor Lydia Edwards just mentioned about the moral statement. And that is so, so true. Because if you're a resident of Boston and you can't pay rent, you go online, you type in can't pay rent, Boston. And the first thing that will pop up is Office of Housing Stability's website. I'm on it right now. And literally the first thing that says is I'm being evicted, link here. I need help paying rent or utilities, link here. All these resources accumulated for residents, easy, very fast to find. If you're in Cambridge, can't pay rent, where do you turn to? There may be an organization out there, but is it from the city? Is it your government telling you that here are your resources? I got you. So it's a moral statement for sure. And as an organizer, it is so helpful to have the Office of Housing Stability in Boston, just because they have way more resources that our organization can provide. We help people stay in their homes. We don't necessarily help find housing for people. And a lot of times that's what people need. And we send them to the Office of Housing Stability. Like you can go there, fill out an intake form, they'll help you look for housing. And it's also like a partnership too. With a friendlier administration in Boston, there's more communication. Right now, the Office of Housing Stability is getting data of notices to quit, which is eviction notices. This department in the city knows where people are being evicted from all over Boston. We don't have that information, but they do. And with more communication, we can help more people.
Just to be clear, this is a part of the city government, Councilor Edwards. It's like a city department, correct?
Correct.
Okay, good.
Yep.
Good stuff. Good stuff. All right, we're going to start with Dr. Sargent on this one. In Cambridge, we rely on taxing private commercial buildings for a lot of our tax revenue, and that supports the affordable housing and other services that we have. Oftentimes people speak about Cambridge having relatively low property taxes for a city like ours. We also have tax exempt institutions, as you know, these small little institutions, Harvard and MIT. You're looking at MIT behind me. But we also adhere to, as you in Boston, Councilor Edwards, the pilot agreement, payment in lieu of taxes. And so people have often asked, you know, should this be changed? Is this right and just? What's your thoughts about it? And obviously, we're thinking about this from the lens that if you were to increase some of these payments, that it could help with the money that Dr. Sargent and others have talked about that's going to be necessary to secure housing for our residents. So Dr. Sargent, why don't you start us off here? Now, you are familiar with the pilot program, correct?
A bit.
So let me give it to you really quickly. And I'll give you the short version. So basically, the universities are tax exempt by some archaic law years ago. And most municipalities, Boston and Cambridge, have a program called the pilot program, in which they, I'm going to say negotiate, that may not be the right word. Councilor Zondervan may hit me up later, but basically the city's leadership agrees to with the university's leadership on what that payment will be on a yearly consistent basis. But it's not, how do we say this? Their land is not taxed as if a other private business were to buy all of MIT. There'd be a commercial rate that would be consistent. So it's kind of, that's in theory what we're talking about. They pay what they want. They pay what they want.
Yeah. So that's, so I will, I'll say this. I don't think it's ever wrong to put pressure on them. I don't think that's ever a problem. Even if it doesn't result in more direct payments, there might be other things that come about. But I think this also goes back to something that Councilor Edwards first started by saying, which is, how did we get here? If we're not willing to acknowledge and admit that these institutions have been an engine for the obliteration of Black and brown people in the community, the erasure of low and moderate income people, the dispersal of people in community, and the destruction of a set of people that have been here for a long time, in scattering them to the wind, if we're not willing to say that these institutions have been engines of white supremacy in the process, in accomplishing these missions, and that a lot of their success in their growth has come at the expense of the people themselves, then the game is we give up the game. So whether that means going through the pilot program, whether it means going through other mechanisms, all you're doing is telling the truth. And so, yeah, I do think we have to put pressure on them as best as possible. That goes to what Alex said about organizing. I think that it's a necessary thing. They pay what they want, but there's also, like, that's one of the few areas of pressure that might be possible, is saying, okay, this program's in place, but like, this is one avenue by which you can help to right some of the wrongs that you have produced. That's a problem that is somewhat unique to Cambridge, but at the same time, problems of nonprofit expansion in low and moderate communities and Black and brown communities has been going on for a long time. I remember a quick version of that was in, there's parts of the South Side of Chicago that while I was there that had issues of the fact that when they needed housing and there was no other money, churches would build elder housing, which is great for people that need housing. But as the churches expanded and expanded and expanded, the tax base went further and further and further away, to the degree that one of the members of the community said, we got enough churches here to save all of Chicago. What we need is a tax base. And those kind of sentiments, which is, like, he was making a point. Like, at some point in time, there has to be a balance between these things. But in Cambridge's situation, that balance isn't around organizations like churches, right. Or other sort of they're under nonprofit status, but they are not community nonprofits. That's something else. Yeah. And so telling the truth, pointing out the history, and then organizing around it to state your claims, I think, is absolutely essential. I don't necessarily think that means that a pilot program is the only way to get it, but I do think it's a great place to start.
Yeah, no, great point. I mean, this isn't, your grandmama's church who bought the little building next to you. These, I believe both the institutions have their own real estate wing, just separate of the university. Like, they have a real estate wing that acquires real estate and develops and that stuff. So it is not your grandmama's church. Councilor Edwards, you want to jump in on this one? And then Alex after?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, no, when it comes to pilot payments, there's several points of attack. We've been looking at it in Boston as a city council, because at the end of the day, you know, they're using their tax exempt status to do what Dr. Sargent mentioned, to not only avoid paying into the kitty, but also remove taxable land so that we can't get additional funds to help. So it's a double whammy.
Right.
And so, you know, we've seen several administrations kind of challenge the tax exempt status of Harvard, which, as you know, its endowment is only second to the Catholic Church. It is so big, and how much resources it has. The thought that it is a tax exempt institution when it chooses not to act as a tax exempt educational institution, it becomes a real estate developer. It's doing all these different things. I believe that this is a complete issue of political will or lack thereof. There's no doubt in my mind, there's two ways in which they are a nonprofit, at the state level and at the federal level. I have said I would love to send up a home rule petition to basically say, or state law in general, to remove tax exempt status for institutions over a certain amount, over a certain size. You only get this much tax that's tax free in the state, and then, you know, they can fight that out with the federal government. I also think that there's just really a genuine concern. You know, we did have some agreements, and we do get $30 million from these tax exempt schools on a regular basis, but it is, the way we measure it is too low. We've also, I don't think we really include all the tax exempt activities. They assume through sales tax or somewhat we're capturing it. We're not. And I just, again, it's a matter of political will. If we honestly just said, just cap how much you can get that's tax-free when you have billions of dollars in your endowment, that would help us to extract additional information, additional resources. Basically what I'm saying is they need to be taxed after a certain point.
No,
It's not politically popular, but I'm sorry, this volunteer program is that they're being donated to us, and that, you know, we should be so thankful that they're willing to give something, is obscene. It's just freaking obscene. And they take so much more, and they might get housing every now and then over there. They might do this, and they were built, these institutions, especially the oldest ones, were built off of slave labor to begin with. If you want to talk about reparations, if you want to talk about if we're going to be in this, you know, spring, this new civil rights movement and dealing with institutional racism, then it's a call on them to acknowledge, hold that mirror up to, you have been able to generate wealth off of slave labor, and so you owe this. This is a debt paid. This isn't a volunteer thing. You are finally paying due on this note.
That's the Counselor Edwards I know. That's the Counselor Edwards I know, and you're exactly right. That this is why I think it's such a joke. The whole notion of you negotiate these small amounts when you're, as Dr. Sargent said, you're taking from both sides, right? You're capitalizing on both sides. You're helping yourself and hurting the community. Alex, you want to jump in on this from the organizer perspective? Alex?
Sorry, guys.
You were doing good until you did the somersault. We're talking about pilot agreements.
Right. I think what has been mentioned was perfect. Yes.
Okay.
They definitely owe a lot to our community, and we need it. So I definitely agree with what was said. I don't really have much to add, but yeah.
Right.
Acknowledging.
So Alex, I'm going to ask a question to you then that I see the Bernie sticker behind you. So this is a little how much of a Bernieite you are. There's a type of development called land trusts or CLTs that are in some cities are introducing. The Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative is a large successful one. Obviously, Bernie, when mayor in Burlington, Vermont, created a big CLT. Can you tell us how this form of home ownership can be a great answer for some low income and moderate residents? We're just kind of thinking out the box a little bit. Oftentimes when I'm in spaces talking about housing, they say you have to be innovative. So yeah. If you know a little bit about this, could you share this kind of?
I know a little bit about land trust, and from my knowledge about land trust, the main difference is folks are agreeing to be stewards rather than owners. And that means that they're taking care of the land and thinking about community completely differently than like a for-profit driven model like we have in private ownership. But I feel like when folks are like trying to pitch land trust to communities of color especially, it can be a little difficult because a part of being on a land trust is you're agreeing to a certain set of rules that, you know, maybe you can't sell your house for market rate. And by agreeing to that, you know, it makes sure that the house stays affordable, but it also means that you now can't partake in the American dream of building wealth the same way like other folks have been able to for so long. So it's like I definitely think that we need to think of housing as a human right, and not like as just like another stock piece that we can speculate on and remove, and by removing housing from the speculative market and putting on a land trust, that's one way of doing it. But it doesn't really answer the question of reparations for our people. And we need to solve that too.
Okay, you know, that's a good, you know, once again, that question was one that we thought was creative, and the people can just, you know, you got to be innovative here. I mean, you know, the old stuff doesn't work. So just thank you for that. There's a history in the city of Cambridge of promoting and building laboratories and high-priced commercial and condominium projects. That results in a loss of the old affordable housing and the gentrification of neighborhoods. Are there strategies that could limit this process, yet still assure the financial success of the city? So this is the balance that we talk about. You all have talked about, you know, making, you know, housing not a privilege, but a right, so to speak. But I guess this question speaks to the balance of promoting laboratories and high-priced commercial condominium projects in the gentrification. And some people see this as something that hurts the overall growth of the city. Dr. Sargent, what's your thoughts on this concept?
So I'll talk about this. I'll also, because I'm gonna have to go after this answer.
Yeah, that's fine.
I gotta get on the road and drive. So here's what I'll say. I think we can limit this process quite easily. Like land is finite, and devoting a significant amount of it towards affordable housing is one way of that just takes some of that away. And actually just building and supplying housing for the community is one way of diverting some of that focus. But I think the bigger the challenge here is the yet still assure the financial success of the city. So there's a lot of different ways to measure success in a city. And unless and until Cambridge is somehow taken out of Massachusetts and put somewhere else, there's going to be avenues and people wanting to come. That's not that. So there's no need for, in terms of the politics, for folks in Cambridge to be begging anyone to come here. Like there should be a certain amount of expectation that when you come here, you're a good part of the community. And so I don't think there should be a fear that going for housing is going to somehow make these other things not possible. And if the only way some of the problems is a lot of times success is measured solely through some of these financial metrics, property values, certain types of revenue, how much certain things go for. And the problem with that is it completely erases people, completely erases what's going on. And so you can have a model in which people see success and growth, and everybody's gone. And so I think the answer to that is to a certain degree, to organize a certain amount of political will around the idea that, unlike some places, the people of Cambridge don't have to worry as much about what's going to happen with financial success and growth, because there's already a base there. What's not present is the other half of that balance already. So unless and until there's an actual plan to help the people that are already there, we shouldn't be worried about what's going on with these big condominiums and these other big laboratories and other stuff. The balance only happens after, I'll put it this way. You only worry about balance when you actually look at what's being balanced. And if you're looking at the scale in placing money for external developers on one side and people for the other, then your idea of balance is already a problem. And so I would say that there's already a need to like that focus is already in the wrong place to be concerned about that. Growth isn't the problem. Housing people is the problem. And I think that a lot of times it's easier, and this relates to the question of how does it relate to Black and brown people? It becomes so much easier to make it about money and not make it about people when you actually are erasing Black and brown people. It matters. It doesn't mean it's only a question of Black and brown people, but one of the problems is when you like there's like ways of making it a lot easier when the displacement is happening that way because of the way space is racialized. And when you have Black people leaving and white people coming in, then you have that people don't like politically, that's oftentimes not thought of as a loss, even though it's an absolute devastation, even though it absolutely is to the community. And that's a part of the language of gentrification in and of itself. So yeah, that's what I would say as far as that goes, is there has to be that, shouldn't worry about balance at all, because balance erases people of color.
Dr. Sargent, thank you for your profound words. Please have a safe trip, and we will be following up with you. I know you have to go.
Thank you. It's been an honor to be a part of this. Take care.
Yep. So to Alex, you want to answer that question around history of Cambridge promoting laboratories and high-price condominium projects and the loss of affordable housing due to the gentrification. Any strategies that could limit the process while not subjecting the city to any other unsuccessful distress?
I am just going to keep harping on organizing. And the people that are most affected have to be seated at the table and making decisions around development of their neighborhood, and making sure that those voices are prioritized in the decision making. And a lot of times, if you really think about historically, all of the wins that we have gotten as a people, they have been because folks resisted, folks got onto the streets and protested. Things weren't given to us. Yeah. We had to take it. and I see that same thing happening around development in our city. If we sit back and let things happen, it's not going to be good. So we really need to wake up and get out there. And it's not always in the streets. Sometimes it's in a Zoom meeting, like this one. So yeah, there are, like in Boston, for example, around development, there's like community groups, neighborhood associations. And these neighborhood associations are usually made up of older white homeowners. And these neighborhood associations review projects that come into the neighborhood.
Yeah.
And they give them the first okay to go to the city and get their approvals to start building. How many of our residents know that these meetings are happening? How many of our residents know that you can go to this meeting and talk about this development and share your opinion and say, no, I'd like it to be this instead? So the more people that we have engaged around these issues, the better things will turn out. And, I really just want to give a shout out to your members that shared their story earlier today, because that is like literally the very first thing you need to do is get out there and tell your story and not be afraid and take that stand for your community. So again, big shout out to those few folks that shared their testimony. I know it's extremely hard, but very powerful.
Absolutely. And you speak to, those groups. I know I had some business in the South End. In the South End, there might be 4,000 groups on every other street. But Councilor Edwards, I'm going to ask you this question about gentrification, but also have you help to land us with the second question. So the first question is addressing the issues of gentrification and the give and take between, laboratories and high-end condominiums as it relates to the success of a city. and the gentrification of neighborhoods that is hurting the affordable housing situation. And then also sort of the second part is tying this all together, how, is it possible to address the housing needs of Black and brown people and the housing needs of all people with an eye on making sure that you're not hurting anybody? I think sometimes there's a misunderstanding that if you're helping Black and brown people with affordable housing, you're then hurting other people. So if you could just lend your perspective on both of those things, it might be helpful.
I would echo what Brian had mentioned before, which is the issue with gentrification and the balance of things. It has everything to do with our definitions of success. So if you define succeeding as a city by getting a lot of tax revenue because you've developed so much, then you have, you've ignored the fact that all of that could be happening and majority of your residents could be being displaced and struggling to pay rent.
Yeah.
And if that is again a political will, if that is considered a success, but oh well, we still got a lot of money coming in, even though majority of our residents are rent burdened and are paying 50, 60, 70% of their income just to stay here, then that is a policy, that's a moral compass that's awry. And so what we need to accept is that cities do change, cities do grow, and that's a good thing. You do want to be able to have industries come in, but what cities are willing to do to prostrate themselves to get the Amazons, to get the Star is embarrassing. You should be proud of being Cambridge or being Boston and say, we are worth you coming in with these certain conditions. And if your zoning and if your laws already have those conditions in there, then they know what they're walking into. But what often happens is they walk in there, and then it takes organizers like Alex and City Life, and then some people with political will to do the back and forth and negotiating and the grinding and extracting as much. And it's exhausting if you're going to try and take on Walmart. It's exhausting if you're going to try and take on one freaking huge institution at a time. And so the city needs to plan. Assume that you are the city of Cambridge and you're badass and they should be coming here. And these are the conditions in which you're going to approach our city. And I think at that point, it really helps the negotiations later, because what you also have in Cambridge being where you're physically located by certain institutions and in terms of who they can employ very quickly, right? Recruiting from your schools and whatnot. That's a huge capital. That's a huge attraction. So I think it's really walk a little prouder and a little bit more protective of the resources that you have. You're Black and brown, you're working class, your people. And then when you approach with respect, put some respect on our name, is how I feel the policy should be saying that to institutions. So then your next question was about, I'm sorry, it was about.
So it was just basically that sometimes I think there's a perception that if you're.
Oh, yeah.
You got it? Okay.
Yeah. And that's a perception that's often used to divide us, so that where there isn't a multiracial, multi-class or different class level, a coalition of people who are proudly saying Black Lives Matter, are proudly saying that when their lives matter, my life is mattering as well. That's a lack of education and intending to divide people. The fact is, if you center and you work for and help people of color, Black people specifically, brown people specifically, you are helping everybody else. There's not a policy that I haven't stated so far that isn't going to help and center Black and brown people that isn't also going to help white working class people. There's not one that I've stated so far. I challenge you to say what I have said with the affirmatively furthering for a housing amendment that does all forms of mitigation, centers those individuals in those groups, that does not help working white class individuals or help middle class people. I'll shut up and wait for someone to tell me I have said something that will not help somebody else. But be careful of the group or the people who do come in there saying that's for them and that's not for you. That is totally intended to divide us. So I have, and I'll say this, being the representative, my district is East Boston, Charlestown, and the North End. And I'm the first person of color to ever represent that district. So dealing with race and dealing with the perception of they're getting this and we're not, I have that conversation all the time. Where the majority of my voters are white and a huge amount of them are white working class. And they're my voters, but we have to have those conversations. So I think that it's a matter of really acknowledging that that's intended to divide us.
No, I think that's perfect. And I know that district well, but you marvelously represented them. So we're going to have our school committee person and secretary of the NAACP. First, I also want to just acknowledge ORC Cambridge. I want to thank them in collaboration with the NAACP for hosting this wonderful event tonight. But I want to have Aisha Wilson, if she can control the chat. There's going to be just a few questions. We won't keep you too much longer, but if you'd stick around, Alex and Councilor Edwards, just to answer a few questions from the audience, we're going to turn it over.
Actually, I'm very sorry, guys, but I have a meeting in 1 minute. And thanks to Zoom, I can actually make that meeting. But it was great conversation. Thank you guys so much for having us. Thank you for holding this conversation. I loved learning from you guys and hearing about all the amazing work being done. And if you heard this conversation and you felt inspired and you want to start something, you want to start organizing, you want to start a group focused on development, or in your building want to form a tenant association, feel free to reach out to me and we can talk about it.
Stay organizing, Alex. You stay organizing even when you say goodbye.
Alex, you got 18 seconds left. You got 18 seconds to get to that meeting, all right?
All right,
Uncle
bye.
Edwards, we're going to keep you around really quickly just to ask a few questions. We won't keep you forever, but we definitely want to get your insight. So Aisha, do you have some stuff going on?
Yes, and thank you, Richard. And again, thank you, Councilor Edwards, and to our panelists for joining us. Before I get to the questions, I do want to just say that this is going to be re-aired on 22 City View, which is channel 22 on Friday, June 18th at 8 p.m., Saturday, June 19th at 2 p.m., and Sunday, June 20th at 5 p.m. It'll also be available on YouTube under 22 City View. So please join us there for a replay, to learn more and for follow-up if you missed any portion of this event here. So Councilor Edwards, one thing that we know in Cambridge is that our property taxes are extremely low. And what are your thoughts about initiatives to raise property taxes to then help the low and moderate income housing market?
I'm on both sides about it. I do think it depends on, I'm happy with raising taxes. Like I said, the transfer fee or the flippers tax, those are extractive measures that I feel that were happening. So we should tax them. You tax the things you don't want. And so I was happy to do those things or lead and push on those things. But I have heard from seniors in my district and throughout the city of Boston who are income poor but house rich. And so when the taxes went up, it put them in a position where they felt specifically overburdened. And they even had, this was the senior exemptions. When you're on a fixed income, if the taxes go up, still they go up, but you don't pay as much as a senior. And so I tend to think before you go to property taxes on individual homeowners or residential exemptions or resident occupied properties, I'd rather you scale it from the larger properties, from the activities and properties that you don't like, and extract there for your income before you raise individual property taxes. That's kind of how I hear it.
I think that's a really great answer and a great approach to how we can, thoughtfully go about, increasing our taxes is really increasing those of, maybe larger developments versus individual people who would then become, who are on fixed incomes or low incomes, but house rich. The next question just goes to, in Cambridge, we do have a low equity, home ownership opportunity. But one thing that we do know is that that home is not able to then be passed down to children in case, God forbid something was to happen to the actual homeowner. What do you think about what programs could we initiate, what may be happening in Boston to help and support individuals in some low limited equity home ownership that so that they have the stability, they have the control of their home, but at the same time establishing some level of investment fund for them that is matched so that a person is developing some level of wealth. And then there's a part two to that that's like, then they can either choose to invest in market rate housing or set up their own businesses or send their child to college or whatever they then want to invest in. So if you could just speak to a little bit of, some opportunities to do that kind of work, but also thinking about the stability of families in limited equity home ownership.
So I feel what Brian had mentioned before was the question of whether when you're dealing with housing and you're seeing it as a wealth generator, that's going to be in conflict with a low or no down payment program that allows you to get into a house and have some stability. But the exchange being, when you leave this house, you're going to give somebody else the opportunity to not pay anything or pay very low to also have and grow and stay in this house. And the frustration I've heard on both sides, right? Why can't I make bank? I mean, what's happened with prices in East Boston when it was an affordable unit and now it's worth, $1 million or something like that. So I understand the frustration, but I think there might be a little bit more of a balanced approach. One, you could stretch out how long you have to stay in it before you can maybe sell. And then you can also maybe raise the cap on the profits that you can make. Because I think for some, it's like 3% or 5%. So you can maybe raise the cap on how much profits they make so they can get a little bit more equity. You could do that. And that way they walk away with a little bit more than they would have, but they don't walk away with so much that someone trying to purchase it is only a developer can afford it. That's one way. I also think there's different streams and ways to look at ownership, not just individual for the whole home, but we're trying to think about creative ways in which to really promote housing cooperatives, where you're owning a stake and a stock and in a building, and you can sell that part in some cooperatives one day. So you could build up equity, you could have that part and sell that ultimately as well. So there's a couple ways I think we need to be more creative with how we own and also really acknowledging, people do need some sort of a higher payout maybe when they sell their homes.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And so Councilor Edwards, as we are heading close to our closing time here, is there anything that you would like to just add in closing that maybe our questions didn't touch on, but you just want to share with our audience here?
Well, we talked about the amendment. So I would encourage every city who has a problem or has the legacy of racism and institutional racism, which is every city, to seriously consider looking at their zoning and the injury caused by it and the healing that could be caused by it. Because you tell developers, that's how you say this is how you're gonna roll. It is for the public welfare, literally, that's what zoning is supposed to be for. So get creative with what is the public welfare for your city and town. That's one thing. And then I know Alex promoted the state law, and I think he put it in the chat for the COVID relief bill, but I also want to promote another bill called the Homes Act, which is the housing opportunity and mobility through eviction sealing. This would allow people to seal their eviction records. If they are evicted at some point in their life, we do allow people with misdemeanors and with felonies to one day seal their records. Right now, majority of people being evicted are Black women, and majority of the people, and the eviction records start immediately upon the filing of the case. They are public and they are permanent, and it's a scarlet letter E. And so we tried last time, we got it to the governor's desk and he vetoed it. So we're trying again for the Homes Act. And so I can put it in the chat, or I can send it maybe to you directly, Aisha. I don't know if you want to put on the NAACP's listserv to promote the Homes Act. PassTheHomesAct.org is the website. It's got all the information, co-sponsors. We always look for co-sponsors. So it would be huge. It dovetails. We need immediate COVID relief, but ultimately coming out of this, people need to be able to move on with their lives.
Wonderful. And that is really helpful to share that information. Well, again, Councilor Edwards, thank you. Richard Harding is coming back in to close us out, but thank you all again. Thank you to our audience for joining us here today.
Yep. So thank you, Councilor Edwards. You're always welcome. We're gonna give you the virtual key to the city, but you're always welcome to come over whenever you want, and good luck. I believe you're up for re-election, is that correct?
Yes, I am up for re-election this year.
You're one of the great advocates for housing, and you've been representing the city of Boston and East Boston in your district extremely well. And so we look forward to your reelection, and, you know, let us know how we can be helpful. I also just want to thank the ORC folks, ORC Cambridge, particularly Shelley, Henry, and I think it was Carolyn, who was mainly with us doing some of the work. And then also the NAACP Executive Committee, Danielle Jones, Kirk Morris, Aisha Wilson, myself, and Ken Reeves, and all of you, you know, for being with us. And a shout out to Calvin and Josh, and well as Danielle, for helping us through the technical stuff. And also Steve Brown, who was not only on our executive committee, but one of the testimonial givers early on. So we want to thank you. And Aisha, I think, is going to put again in the chat when this will be re-aired. And we do look forward to our next conversation. This is an important conversation. Affordable housing is a crisis in Cambridge and Boston and across many communities of color. And we are just so thankful that you were with us tonight. You could be anywhere in the world. So thank you, and we're going to sign off. Thank you.